We have these global drumbeats of war that are growing louder and louder. We're at the same time seeing an increasing crackdown on civil liberties, including free speech, the right to protest, all in the global north. And that obviously includes Britain. So, for example, we've got a recent Palestine activist making the headlines for scaling Big Ben and occupying it for 16 hours in protest against the treatment of the Filton 18, the Palestine Action activist being detained on the basis of terrorism connections, so-called. For those not familiar with the UK democratic rights, could you give us an overview of how these are currently under attack and how can we build a successful anti-war movement in these conditions of repression?
Yeah, that's a really important question because the rollback of democratic rights in Britain has been accelerating. You can take it back quite a long way. You can point to the use of counter-terror legislation under Tony Blair and things to show that protest rights were being restricted even then. But actually, since the 2019 election in particular, when Boris Johnson defeated Jeremy Corbyn, there's been a real raft of repressive legislation passed through Parliament. Laws to give state agents the right to break the law if they're serving some sort of national interest by doing so. Laws to put British soldiers serving abroad beyond the reach of human rights law, making them not accountable for war crimes and so on committed in the field. And we've seen this attacks on domestic protests. There's a whole number of different laws that have been passed, each of which has successively restricted protest further and further. The Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Act in 2022, that introduced really heavy sentences for extremely vague offences. So you can get 10 years in prison for causing a public nuisance. This is legislation which is designed to give the police enormous leeway to decide when and where we can protest, because they can just say, well, we say that you're causing a nuisance, and then arrest you and shut down the protest. We saw the Public Order Act, which allows the government to effectively stop protests before they cause any disruption. If they think they're going to cause any disruption down the line, they can then shut down the protest. And we're seeing these really draconian sentences being handed out, in particular to climate protesters, the Just Stop Oil movement. We've seen, years-long sentences for people for holding a Zoom meeting to plan blocking a motorway. We've also seen attacks via the judiciary and the judicial system, with judges telling juries, you're not allowed to listen to arguments about why people took the actions, in terms of you're not allowed to listen to arguments about climate change or so on, because that's not relevant to determining whether whether the defendant is innocent or guilty of the charge. And people have had their sentences increased for trying to explain their actions in court. So it's quite a frightening picture. And as we've seen on the January the 18th Palestine demonstration, there have been a number of attempts to shut down this movement, but evidently the Labour government has now decided it's the time to do so. The police were extremely obstructive of that demo. They wouldn't allow it to march on its usual route. They've started using, again, kind of these sort of vague and unsubstantiated claims to close down protests. So one being used on January the 18th, but also for the march that's taking place on the 15th of March. The police have been saying, well, because your route goes within a mile of a synagogue here, we're going to have to reroute it because of the upset to the Jewish community that you might cause. Now, not one of those demos has seen any attacks on Jewish people. Not one of them has seen any attack on a synagogue or any disruption to any worship. So there's no evidence that these marches are any kind of a threat to synagogues, but they're able to say, oh, well, there's a perception in the Jewish community that these marches are threatening, so it's upsetting, so we have to shut it down. And I think there are lessons for the left on a broader level there, in terms of not allowing this idea that we can start policing people's feelings and emotions and so on, because it's a very easy thing for the state to turn around and say, well, we're going to shut up your movement because it's upsetting someone. But at the same time, it's being more, we saw that under Jeremy Corbyn to an extent with the allegations of anti-Semitism, where it said, well, we don't need to investigate whether anyone was actually anti-Semitic. The only thing that matters is that these people say that they were offended, and that demonstrates that Labour has a problem. On the January the 18th demo, not only did the police block the original route, but they then intervened to basically trap the leaders of the march. The police lines parted to allow the leaders of the march to go through them to lay flowers, as they had said they were going to lay in memory of children killed in Gaza. And then they turned around and arrested them for supposedly breaking through police lines. Chris Nynham, the chief steward of that march, was completely unnecessarily knocked to the ground by officers who jumped on him and arrested him. And they also made more than 70 arrests and charged both Chris Nineham and Ben Jamal, the leader of the Palestine Solidarity Campaign, with public order offences. Those cases are ongoing. But almost more ominously still, nearly 7 weeks afterwards, the police suddenly issued another 8 invitations for police questioning to other people who were on that demo. So this includes an 87-year-old Holocaust survivor, Stephen Kapos, who again laid flowers in an unauthorized place and has been asked to come and talk to the police about why he did that. This is an attempt, if you look at the names of the people who've been summoned, they include people like Andrew Murray, who's a reporter at our newspaper, but also a senior figure in the Stop the War Coalition. It includes Lindsay German, who's the convener of the Stop the War Coalition, Sophie Bolt, who's the General Secretary of the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament. They are trying to intimidate and decapitate the peace movement in Britain and say, we're not having these marches anymore, we're fed up of them, and we're going to cause trouble for you. So our answer to that essentially has to be to double down and not allow them to shut us down. They tried to do this. The previous Conservative government tried to do this right at the beginning of the Palestine demonstrations back in the autumn of 2023, just after the Israeli invasion of Gaza had begun. And Suella Braverman, the Home Secretary at the time, she essentially called the far right out onto the streets to try and block the Armistice Day demonstration, November the 11th, 2023. And that completely backfired on her. There was a brawl between these far-right activists and the police at the Cenotaph in London, and the march was the biggest of all of the Palestine demonstrations that we've had, 800,000 people on the streets that day. And Suella Braverman, she was chucked out of office essentially as a result of the failure of her strategy. So after that point, despite regular calls from senior figures in the establishment, including the one-time extremism, the special advisor on extremism, Lord Walney, who in a previous life was John Woodcocker, particularly right-wing Labour MP, who was ennobled for his attacks on Jeremy Corbyn. They've been calling for this movement to be banned for a long time, saying that the slogans are anti-Semitic, saying these are hate marches, and so on. And we've seen that in some other countries. One of the most frightening is Germany. I was in Germany in January for the Rosa Luxemburg conference, an annual socialist conference. It's followed every year by a march to the graves of Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht in Berlin. And the Palestine section of that march was attacked by the police. In Germany, we've also seen people convicted for chanting "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free." That slogan has been banned in Germany. That's something which Suella Braverman, again, she talked about banning it in Britain, but the government has not been able to because the size of the movement has been so considerable. And in Germany, the level of repression has got to the state where the UN Special Rapporteur on Palestine, venues have been shut down for trying to host speeches by a UN official. And in the end, so many venues cancelled speeches. 2 universities, one in Munich, one in Berlin, cancelled speeches by her under government pressure. A Berlin venue did so, and in the end it was a socialist newspaper, Junge Welt, which had to host her speech in its own offices because all of the other venues had pulled out of her speaking tour. And even in that occasion, the Germans sent 100 riot police to basically stand in the lecture hall and intimidate everybody, stop them listening to a talk on international law by an Italian lawyer. It's quite extreme. And that's what they're trying to do in this country. Our best defense against that is to make sure the movements continue to be really, really big. The situation in Palestine, there's been a ceasefire in Gaza, although Israel has violated that multiple times. But it's accompanied that ceasefire by a massive expansion of violence and ethnic cleansing in the West Bank. And Donald Trump has said that we're going to ethnically cleanse the whole of Gaza. The Israeli government's very keen on this plan. So the idea that the Palestine movement can shut up shop and go home because there's a ceasefire is complete nonsense. And we have to keep mobilizing because the government would really, really like to crack down on it. But at the moment, up to date, essentially, the Met Police have been saying, well, a movement this size is very, very difficult to ban. They're getting more aggressive, and that means we have to get more determined as well. I think there's a very dishonest narrative in much of the media that we need stricter anti-protest laws and anti-crackdowns on free speech and so on to defend democracy from authoritarianism abroad. But actually, this is just paving the way for the far right across Europe. We're giving states more and more power, giving police forces more and more power over us. And it's all in the name of defending liberal democracy. But in all of these states, the far right is on the march. And then these laws are exactly the ones that can be used by a future government of someone like Marine Le Pen or the AfD or Nigel Farage to then take our countries in an even more authoritarian direction. So don't trust the liberals. They're actually often some of the most authoritarian people around at the moment.